The people of Queens, New York come from all over the world, seeking a new way of life with opportunities for a better life for them and their children. While they eventually get caught up in the busy lifestyle of the Big Apple, they each yearn for a taste of their own homelands. The Queen's Digest magazine continues to write about stories from the homelands of these different people from different places, talking about things they understand and feel. We will be discussing stories from the Caribbean, including Guyana, from Central and South America, and many countries in Europe. We will learn about these different people who are now our neighbours, schoolmates, workmates, and the people from whom we buy our groceries too. So sit back and let's find out about the people who came and continue to come to Queens, New York. Is there a Cuban community in Queens, New York? Yes. There certainly is a significant Cuban community in Queens, particularly in neighborhoods like Corona and Jackson Heights. These areas, along with the stretch of Junction Boulevard and Roosevelt Avenue, were once dotted with Cuban businesses and saw a substantial Cuban population. While the population may have decreased slightly in Queens between 1980 and 1990, there still remains a notable Cuban presence. Queens has a diverse population with a significant Hispanic community, and Cuban culture is still celebrated in the area through music, dance, and cuisine. Let's talk about that. Hi there and welcome once again to the Queen's Digest magazine. Here is where we attempt to learn about the many different people of Queens, New York, who they are, where they come from and what their cultures are like. I am your host Ryan, and in today's episode we'll try to learn a bit more about the history of the Cuban people. The history of Cuba is a captivating narrative and is interwoven with threads of colonialism, revolution, and Cold War tensions. From its indigenous roots to its contemporary reality, Cuba's story is one of resilience and transformation and forms an integral part of the history of the Caribbean region and the people of Queens, New York. Let's take a look into some key moments of Cuba's history, including the proposed exchange of Florida for Cuba, the rise and fall of the Batista regime, and the seismic shift brought about by Fidel Castro's revolution. We begin with the early colonial period and the shadow of expansionism. Before the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492, Cuba was inhabited by indigenous Taino and Siboney populations. However, Spanish colonization brought about a devastating decline in the native population due to disease and forced labor. The island of Cuba eventually became a vital and strategic point in the Spanish Empire, serving as a crucial port for the treasure fleet sailing between the Americas and Europe. The island's fertile land also facilitated the development of sugar plantations, which fueled the transatlantic slave trade and shaped its social and economic structure. The dawn of the 19th century witnessed the rise of Cuban nationalism and the growing desire for independence from Spain. The 10 Years' War from 1868 to 1878, and the Little War, between 1879 and 1880, were early attempts to break free from Spanish rule, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. During this period, the United States began to cast its gaze upon Cuba, viewing the island as a strategic and economic prize. The idea of the United States acquiring Cuba had not been a new one. As early as the 1820s, figures like Thomas Jefferson expressed interest in annexing the island. The concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the North American continent, fueled this desire. The Ostend Manifesto of 1854, a secret document written by U.S. diplomats, even suggested that the United States should seize Cuba if Spain refused to sell it. The proposed exchange of Florida for Cuba was a less discussed, but still existing idea. The U.S. had acquired Florida from Spain in 1819, and some believed that swapping the peninsula for Cuba would be a mutually beneficial arrangement. Florida was seen as a swampy, less valuable territory, while Cuba was a rich and strategically important island. This idea never materialized, but it highlights the persistent U.S. interest in acquiring Cuba. Let's look now at the Spanish-American War and the Platt Amendment. The Cuban War of Independence, from 1895 to 1898, led by figures like José Martí, reignited the struggle for freedom. The sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in 1898 provided the United States with a pretext to intervene, leading to the Spanish-American War. Spain's defeat at the end of that war resulted in Cuba's nominal independence, but the United States imposed the Platt Amendment in 1901, which granted the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuban affairs and establish a naval base at Guantanamo Bay. This amendment effectively turned Cuba into a U.S. protectorate, limiting its sovereignty and fueling resentment among Cubans. The early 20th century was marked by political instability and U.S. influence in Cuba. American corporations dominated the Cuban economy, particularly the sugar industry, and U.S. political interference was frequent. This period saw the rise of political figures like Gerardo Machado, whose authoritarian rule in the 1920s and 1930s sparked widespread opposition. Then there was Fulgencio Batista. Fulgencio Batista, a former army sergeant, rose to prominence in the 1930s. He initially presented himself as a reformer, but his rule gradually became more authoritarian. Batista's influence in Cuban politics was significant, and he effectively controlled the country through puppet presidents. In 1952, he seized power in a military coup, establishing a repressive dictatorship. Batista's regime was characterized by corruption, violence, and the suppression of dissent. He cultivated close ties with the U.S. government and American corporations, which further fueled resentment among Cubans. The economic inequality and social injustice under Batista's rule created fertile ground for revolutionary movements. This gave way to the next group of Cuban rulers. The rise of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro, a young lawyer and political activist, emerged as a leading figure in the opposition to Batista. In 1953, he led an attack on the Moncada barracks, a failed attempt to spark an uprising. Though the attack was unsuccessful, it brought Castro and his revolutionary ideals to national attention. After his release from prison, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he formed the 26th of July movement. In 1956, he returned to Cuba with a small group of rebels, including his brother Raúl Castro and Ernesto Che Guevara. They established a guerrilla base in the Sierra Maestra Mountains and began a campaign of armed resistance against Batista's regime. Castro's charisma, strategic brilliance, and commitment to social justice resonated with many Cubans, particularly the poor and marginalized. The revolutionary movement gained momentum, attracting support from students, workers, and peasants. Batista's regime, plagued by corruption and internal divisions, began to crumble. In 1959, Batista fled Cuba, and Castro's revolutionary forces entered Havana, marking the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. The revolution brought about significant social and economic changes, including land reform, nationalization of industries, and improvements in education and healthcare. However, it also led to the suppression of political opposition and the establishment of a one-party socialist state. Castro's socialist ideology and his alignment with the Soviet Union during the Cold War transformed Cuba into a focal point of international tension. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in the Western Hemisphere, imposed an economic embargo on Cuba and supported attempts to overthrow Castro's government. In the United States, this fear of the spread of communism created what came to be known as the Red Scare or McCarthyism. This was a political and sometimes violent campaign against anyone and anything that was perceived as having the slightest hint of communist influence. Some historians also credit this fear of communism as having led to the removal of Cheddi Jugan as the premier of then British Guiana. In 1961, the US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion, an attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro, ended in a humiliating defeat for the United States. This event further solidified Castro's control over Cuba and strengthened his alliance with the Soviet Union. This ultimately led to the next really big event in the history of this Caribbean country, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis occurred in 1962. This was a 13-day confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union and brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The discovery of Soviet missiles in Cuba prompted a U.S. naval blockade and a tense standoff. The crisis was ultimately resolved through diplomatic negotiations, with the Soviet Union agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. As the years went by, Cuba continued to receive political and financial support from the USSR, and this kept the island country going in the face of the U.S. trade embargo. However, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 plunged Cuba into a severe economic crisis known as the Special Period. The loss of Soviet aid and trade led to shortages of food, fuel, and other essential goods. Cuba's economy struggled to adapt to the new reality, but the government implemented some reforms to attract foreign investment and boost tourism. But the 21st century would see a change in U.S.-Cuban relations. In the 21st century, Cuba continues to navigate the challenges of economic development and political reform. The death of Fidel Castro in 2016 marked the end of an era, but his brother Raúl Castro and his successor, Miguel Díaz-Canel, have continued to guide the country. In 2014, the United States and Cuba announced a historic change in relations, leading to the restoration of diplomatic ties and the easing of some travel and trade restrictions. However, the U.S. trade embargo remains in place, and the future of U.S.-Cuban relations remains uncertain. Cuba's history is a testament to the island's resilience and its enduring struggle for self-determination. The legacy of the Cuban Revolution, the impact of U.S. intervention, and the ongoing quest for economic and political reform continue to define Cuba's place in the world. Figures suggest that more than 140,000 Cubans now live in New York City. Cubans who immigrate to the U.S. are drawn to communities where there is already a flourishing Cuban population. In Queens, New York, there are many opportunities for Cubans to enjoy their heritage in the city's many clubs, restaurants, cafes, and bars. From the era of Spanish colonialism to the Cold War and beyond, Cuba has played a significant role in shaping the history of the Americas, and today, the Cuban communities remain a very big part of all the people who live and work in Queens, New York. Well, there we have it, some information about Cubans, one of the many different peoples of Queens, New York. We hope that you found today's episode of the Queen's Digest magazine interesting. Do you know someone who is from the island of Cuba? Do you enjoy Cuban cuisine? Do you have friends who are Cubans? Please share your comments, this helps us to learn from each other. Thank you for staying with us, and we trust that you will join us for the next episode of the Queen's Digest magazine. Goodbye for now.